Water brought most of our ancestors to this continent. And water took them westward into it. Water was their road to freedom and sometimes riches, their source of inspiration and adventure. That's also true on a boat named Driftway for a group of young Americans and Canadians right out of college. Over a 3-year period, they covered 25,000 miles along the waterways of North America, from Nova Scotia to the Gulf of Mexico. A professional crew operated the boat while teams of young people documented the journey. Among them, Bill Arnold from Mohawk College in Hamilton, Ontario. Tom Miller, a graduate of the University of Florida. And Julie Wright from the University of Southern California. Travel with them to visit the places and meet the people they discovered along the way. Like a bunch of folks who enjoy wrecks. A male who carries the mail like no one else. And a female who runs a post office in the wilderness. Join the crew of the Driftwood as they travel the eastern Great Lakes, the waters that unite and divide the United States and Canada. The Canadian-U.S. border is the longest undefended boundary in the world, and nearly half of that lies underwater, mostly beneath the Great Lakes. This journey would take the Driftwood crew across 3 of them, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. Even Tom Miller, who grew up on the Atlantic Ocean, and Julie Wright, who grew up on the Pacific, were impressed.
The biggest surprise to me about the Great Lakes were their size.
They're inland seas, they're absolutely enormous. There's a tremendous amount of commerce and activity on these lakes.
Until 1959, most of that activity was restricted to Canadian and U.S. ships. Seagoing vessels were forced to stop where the river ended, the port of Montreal. Then the St. Lawrence Seaway opened up the Great Lakes to foreign carriers. Montreal became the gateway.
A lot of activity was going on the port when we were there, and that's where we met the warden of the port, whose job it is to oversee everything that gets put on ships and gets taken off of ships.
I have to go down and see Elias this afternoon over a matter, and I wondered...
If Montreal is the gateway to Western Canada and the U.S., Dermot Byrne is the gatekeeper. The port handles 20 million tons of cargo each year. Everything from grain and chemicals to steel bars and hemp. Byrne supervises the loading of most of the ships that come through here.
What's the maximum weight that we're talking here?
Before they can leave, they must pass his inspection.
But how thick is this plywood?
Put it in terms that maybe just people who have not been around a port can understand is if you were to move your home, you wanted to make sure all your furniture and your belongings were safely packed and packed correctly. That's pretty much what Captain Byrne does.
This field is open here to me.
I assumed that maybe that would be taken care of by the captain of the ship, but apparently the captain is not as concerned with the cargo as the owner of the cargo.
Have you seen this one? Frankly, I don't like what I see too much here.
And that's exactly why the job of port warden was created in the first place.
These merchants were finding that some of their cargo was damaged, and it was very expensive for them. So if they could get somebody to check it out as it was being loaded to make sure that the containers were safe and weren't going to bust up and everything, then they would guarantee that the cargo would arrive safely.
So in 1860, a group of Montreal businessmen hired someone to look after their interests on the docks.
Has he got a bridge fitting on the top of those?
Lloyd's of London and places like this, they know about the activities of the Montreal Port Warden.
Byrne says he inspects about 500 ships a year. He has to recheck some of those as many as 5 times before they get it right.
He's working 7 days a week at times, all hours, 24 hours of the day. He could be out at 2 in the morning going out and inspecting a ship coming in from Japan or other points around the world.
As Canada's largest container port, Montreal brings in $1 billion a year to the region. By keeping losses down, the port warden is an important part of that equation. The job has always been privately funded, which makes it unusual. Although some of its guidelines are set by the Canadian Coast Guard, it is not a government job. Even so, Captain Burns' position is one of the most powerful on the docks.
He has the right to stop ships if he feels that they're not loaded properly, and he's done that on occasion. Basically, he doesn't worry about what it costs the people, but his job is to make sure that the cargo is safe.
Before becoming port warden, Byrne was a sea captain who traveled these same waters.
He realized how much time he was spending away from his family. He finally decided to take a land job.
I had seen a lot of places, done a lot of things, and it was time to call it a day. I had passed through here many times on my way up to the Great Lakes, and I got to know the people here very well. I liked them, and they knew me. So Montreal was a choice for me.
Since the continent was settled, Montreal has been the choice for many. Its location on the river once made it a fur trading center, and then the largest inland port in the world. Now it's the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the Canadian province of Quebec.
Going to American schools, we were not taught anything about Canada, nothing. I mean, I knew nothing about the provinces or about the industry or about the land itself or the people. So it was really an educational experience to come up here and really see Canada for the first time, and it was really beautiful.
From Montreal, driftwood traveled down the St. Lawrence to Lake Ontario and made a turn northwest onto the Trent Severn. The inland waterway was started in the early 1800s to shorten the trip to Lake Huron and to encourage settlement of the rich farmland in the province of Ontario. A system of canals was built connecting existing lakes and rivers. 43 locks raise and lower the water levels along the Trent Severn so boats can make it through the often hilly terrain. At one point, the drop is so high, a marine railway was built to carry vessels over land. It is considered one of the engineering marvels of North America. When it was built back in 1910, it was easier to do than putting a lock there. Later, in the 1970s, it served another purpose, keeping parasitic sea lampreys in the Great Lakes from invading inland waters. These days, the Trent Severn is mainly used as a recreational waterway. Boaters from as far away as Florida come here for the beauty. And while the scenery held some attraction for the crew, they were more interested in the Trent Severn as a shortcut. But driftwood had to get special permission to try it, because although the water levels are usually deep enough, the system only guarantees a channel depth of 5 feet, and the driftwood needs 6.
I think we were the second largest vessel to travel through that waterway. And it was very important we were not to come aground and damage anything on the vessel, because if we had it, we would have been held up for God knows how long.
Despite a few bumps along the bottom, driftwood made it through. And the 240-mile waterway shaved days off their trip.
The Trent Severn brought us out into Georgian Bay, and we traveled north from Midland up to Parry Sound.
But the waters there were even more difficult to navigate than the Trent Severn.
Look at that, 8 feet of water. Oh my gosh.
Matt Rombo works for the Canadian Coast Guard. He's based in Parry Sound. It's up to Matt and other members of his crew to guide boats safely through this natural obstacle course.
Georgian Bay has a lot of shoals, a lot of shallow spots because of all the islands, 30,000 islands. And if you're an inexperienced boater, it can be quite dangerous.
Right there, Matt.
Our primary responsibility is navigational aids, making sure the buoys and the range markers are in where they belong. We also do search and rescue in all of the Great Lakes. and the waterway systems in between.
What is now the Canadian Coast Guard got its start more than 300 years ago when the country began building ships and training sailors. As Canada's population grew, water traffic increased. Travel was often hazardous, and the Coast Guard was needed to protect boaters from the perils of the sea.
We've got some people that come up here in sailboats with nothing but a road map, and they're the ones that we go out and pick up on the weekends because they're high and dry on an island.
They're responsible for any ship going through that one channel. So it's a lot of responsibility.
On Matt's boat, there's a 5-man crew, a captain and 4 deckhands.
I'm pretty well the youngest guy on most of the boats I work on. I'm 22. A lot of the guys have been around for anywhere from 5 to 15 years. Some of them look after me and some of them just sort of muddle on in their own way.
Spending the time with Matt was great because he was about the same age and we had, I think, a lot in common.
In fact, life on the Coast Guard cutter is much like that on the Driftwood.
It was sort of like us shooting ourselves there for a minute. There's definitely a lot of parallels to be made there.
Oh yeah, definitely. Even when it comes time for mealtime. I mean, the guys on the Coast Guard vessel eat hearty meals, and very similar on Driftwood. I mean, we have a large galley that can accommodate just about any kind of meal you want to prepare. And it was great to spend the time with Matt and see him operating aboard the Coast Guard.
Driftwood left Perry Sound and headed out onto Georgian Bay. As they continued north, the area became less populated, and by the time the crew was ready to stop for the day, they were in wilderness. They felt a little like the voyageurs must have felt when the only other people here were Indians. Among the tribes who lived along the northern shore of Lake Huron were members of the Algonquin family, Ottawa, Potawatomi, Ojibwe. Many of their descendants still make their homes here. Their traditions have survived years of change, as the crew found out when they went to a powwow on Manitoulin Island. In the 1800s, when the British were settling the area, they signed a treaty with the Indians, giving them the entire island, the largest in the Great Lakes. But many of the tribes preferred to live elsewhere, and eventually the British took it back. European settlement continued to spread among the Indians, and occasionally the two cultures mixed. Jim McGregor is Ojibwe and Scottish. He lives and works on a bay named after his great-grandfather, who was an explorer.
He was the first one that came into this area. My grandfather, he married one of the girls from the area, and I guess apparently she was a princess of the tribe. You had to learn the language and be able to speak it as soon as possible, and I suppose be able to write it. And from what I hear, it took him 6 months to learn the language and to write it. And that was quite an achievement.
Jim was a tribal chief for 12 years, and both he and his wife, Georgina, speak Ojibwe.
It's a nice day.
Miigwech. That means thank you.
Just turn that key, see what happens.
But to their regret, they're the only ones in the family who speak it.
Like our kids have lost the language. Very unfortunate. I guess we're at fault. We should be the ones that should have taught them the language, and we didn't.
What he and Georgina have done, though, is build a business where they can work along with their children on the shores of McGregor Bay.
It took some time, but I think at least I fulfilled my dream of trying to build a little store in a little marina. And hopefully the family can eventually take it over and run it as a family business.
Jim is hoping his grandson will continue the line. And if the parking lot is any indication, the business will still be going strong when he's old enough to take over. Most of these cars belong to the summer people who own houses out on the islands in McGregor Bay. They park at the marina for the season and are taken to their cabins by boat, Jim's boat. For many, he is the last link to the mainland.
It's
sort of interesting to think that your roads are water. I mean, that's the only thing you have. We went with the McGregors, wound around these great rocks.
And the neat thing about this is that here we were traveling through McGregor Bay with a man that the bay was named after his ancestors.
From there we went, worked our way over to the Turners. They run a shop, I guess could parallel the McGregor shop, except that this shop is actually within these islands.
Like Jim McGregor and others in the recreation business, Jib and Debbie Turner depend on summer people for income. The season lasts only 6 weeks here, from July to mid-August, but it's when the Turners make most of their money. There are about 500 islands in McGregor Bay, with cottages on about 300 of them. And the Turners take care of all the needs of the people who vacation there.
Every Wednesday we have to go into Sudbury to pick up our supplies. My mother-in-law and I do that. And we haul back 2 18-foot Starcrafts full of groceries right to the top.
As long as the Turners are here, no one ever has to go back to the mainland. Debbie runs the post office and the general store. Jib pumps the gas. They're the resident experts on local history. They handle cottage rentals. And if something needs to be hauled, Jib does it. They also have the only phone.
Well, tell them to try and come up here. It's absolutely glorious.
We can contact them by the CB radio if the telephone message comes in for them.
035 calling Bill Shedenhelm. Bill Shedenhelm.
One way or the other, we'll get it to them.
In case I have to take this over there, I guess.
Well, there's always in the case of accidents and other kinds of deaths, that's sometimes can be pretty difficult to deliver, but I make up for it by delivering the ones that are nice messages, like grandchildren and things like that being born.
He is sort of like the liaison between these people who live on the islands and any kind of civilization. You know, everybody really depends on him and Debbie both. No matter how much people want to be isolated from civilization, they still have these needs, you know, and he provides them. They both provide them.
But even in this virtual paradise, reality intrudes. When the driftwood crew passed through the area, Jib and Debbie were involved in a battle against a mining company that wanted to dig a quarry into the side of a mountain. It seems that part of the countryside is rich in silica.
The piece of property that they're talking about, the mining, is one of the nicest looking areas in probably the world. We don't have anything against any light industry of any kind going on in the area, but when you start talking about destroying something forever, it's very hard to swallow. And we've been quite successful, I think, so far in putting a stop to it.
But the battle lines continue to harden between Canadian environmentalists and the mining and lumber industries. Everyone talks about a balancing of interests. But more often than not, one party or another wants it balanced their way. And it isn't always a special interest group doing the arguing, which is something the driftwood crew learned when they got to their next stop.
Along the northern shore of the North Channel is a huge lumber industry. We pulled into a town, Thessalon, and from far in the distance on the horizon, you just see this huge plant.
The Birchland Veneer Company is one of 3 mills in the small town of Thessalon, Ontario. These companies make up a large part of the area's economy, and all 3 depend on timber to keep going. But as the public has become more aware of environmental issues, restrictions have been placed on logging. That affects the mills, which in turn affect the workers, and with their livelihoods in jeopardy, many here are not so sure that the ecology movement is such a good thing. Of the 1,700 people in town, more than half of the adults work for the Birchland Veneer Company, and it's not unusual to find entire families employed at the mill.
What you have there is a town who's, for generations, has depended on this industry. And we met a family that I think is typical of the area.
Victor Sherman and his wife Clara have lived here most of their lives. Their children were born here, And when they grew up, they went to work with Victor and Clara at the mill. Brenda, the oldest daughter, says she works there because it's so close to home. Her sister Wanda, who used to work at a convenience store, chose it because she could get weekends and holidays off. As for Victor...
But I don't know, it's just a job, that's all, but it just seemed that it's something you take to it.
I kind of got the feeling that it's not so much that they really like doing what they're doing, it's just that it's a good, steady job, and it pays well, and it provides great benefits. And for a town like that, that's gold.
Like most of us, the Shermans have some complaints about their job.
Wintertime, the cold weather. 45 below zero sitting up top of that thing. That's the worst part, just the wintertime, eh?
The worst is the heat. That's all. Just the heat. I love my job, but it's very, very hot in the summer.
Still, the Shermans consider themselves lucky. And as long as the work holds out, this is where they'll stay.
Probably this is the way our life is going to be. Just it's quiet, working.
Got to work to survive, so.
Survival is on everyone's mind on this part of Lake Huron, where Canada and the United States share the western shore. And while the security the Sherman family seeks in Thessalon could be at risk, in eastern Michigan, the fight for survival is already at hand. Many in these parts feel their only hope is in the resort business. But for one reason or another, most vacationers overlook them. It's often called the forgotten side of Michigan. In fact, when the state put out a book to celebrate the sesquicentennial, they forgot to mention it. The driftwood put into the town of Alpena, Michigan. As good an example as any of both beauty and strange lack of visitors in the area. It was there they met Bill and Ruth Ann Beck, folks who not only live on the water, but work under it as well.
So when he started talking about perhaps we should start a dive charter operation, I sort of had sand and palm trees in my eyes, and that's kind of what I had in mind. And when he finally said Alpena, I said, well, what's in Alpena?
Certainly not a lot of tourists. It has a year-round population of 30,000, which increases slightly in the summer and falls right off again as soon as the biting winds of winter begin to blow.
It's tough. He generally has a few jobs through the wintertime, but we do a lot of classes teaching scuba diving, and the summers are good to us, providing the weather is good.
While we're out here on the shipwreck...
And if it isn't, it's lonely in the summer too. So why did they choose to settle down here?
The thing that makes Alpena really unique is the fact that it has the wrecks that are shallow, which are so essential for the novice divers that are just learning how to dive.
Went out and took a look at this one boat called the Nordemeer, which went down in the late 60s. Enormous, enormous ship, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 stories tall. Only the top part of it is out of the water, and a little bit of the stern, I think. Must be just hellacious storms out there.
The most destructive storm in the history of Great Lakes shipping left its mark here in 1913. All the lakes were affected, but Huron was hit the hardest. A dozen ships were blown ashore, and 8 freighters, 5 American and 3 Canadian, went down with no survivors. One of them, a 500-footer, lies upside down just off the coast of Alpena.
Estimated at over 200 shipwrecks in the area, 80 known shipwrecks for sure, and I think we have 13 or 14 dive sites moored this year.
These shipwrecks are marked by buoys, and the scuba divers will go out and anchor to the buoy and go down the line to the shipwreck. They're down for about 20 minutes. It gives them a chance to take a good look around. They go to several shipwrecks on every excursion.
Perhaps the Becks are among the very few who know about the great diving in the area. Or maybe it's not a big enough attraction. But whatever the reason, there still don't seem to be many tourists here. And sometimes Bill feels like he and Ruth Ann are the only ones in town who care.
I think that Bill Beck is right, that perhaps the locals really don't encourage that much of tourism, and I can't say that I blame them. I think it's a beautiful coast, and if I lived there, I'd probably want to keep it for myself also.
Driftwood headed south, leaving the forgotten part of Michigan for perhaps the most notorious, Detroit.
Trouble, trouble, trouble. Trouble is all in the world I see. Well, you know, I wonder, people, what in the world is gonna happen to me?
When people think of Detroit, they think of a city in decline.
Trouble is all in the world I see.
Down along the waterfront, things are busy. The Detroit River connects Lake Huron to Lake Erie by way of Lake St. Clair. This is where a fur trader named Cadillac landed in 1691 and set up a community. At first, it was mostly farms. Then commerce took over, and the river became a major shipping channel. It is still one of the world's busiest waterways. Over 6,000 vessels pass through here each year. But as the Driftwood crew found out, more than a third of them never even stop. And that made the crew wonder, how do people on those big boats get mail and personal goods? They got the answer at the J.W. Westcott Company, which has been making deliveries to ships for more than a century.
And they go out to the river and take the mail out to these big ocean-going liners. And just a wild experience being on this boat.
Pilot Bob Handyside says it handles like a little sports car. Along with mate Sam Buchanan, he makes several trips a day.
And the dispatcher talks to the boats on the radio, and he relays the messages to us, and we get all their freight and their mail out. Basically, that's what we do. That's our whole day.
What he has to do is he has to maneuver the boat so that he is at the exact same speed as the vessel which is picking up the mail, and they'll drop a line down, and Sam will tie the line on and he'll pull the mail up.
In the 1860s, when the company first started, they did the job by rowboat. But in those days, a big ship was 100 feet long. Today, the locks in the Great Lakes system can handle vessels over 1,000 feet in length. One thing that hasn't changed over the years is the stuff Westcott and Company is sometimes asked to deliver, like a chihuahua for a captain's wife, or a frozen tuna as big as a person. And it's fairly common for them to deliver human cargo.
On the Great Lakes, for these saltwater ships to navigate, they have to have pilots, which are either American or Canadian, and they know the waters real well, and they have to have a pilot on board. So we're one of the pilot exchange points. So when a saltwater boat goes by here, we remove the pilot that's aboard and then put a new pilot on there, and he takes it on up to Port Huron, or if they're going down the river, to Port Colborne, or Toledo, or other Lake Erie ports.
As Driftwood left Detroit and headed south, it also made a change of crew. Jennifer Cleveland from Manchester College in Indiana joined the others in Toledo.
It wasn't real busy when we were there. There was a lot of road construction and a lot of cars moving, but not very many people on foot.
Toledo has tried to change that by redoing its waterfront. The city sits at the mouth of the Maumee River, the largest to flow into the Great Lakes. But Toledo's location on Lake Erie is what made it a major industrial port. It became a transportation hub for cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago, and played a major role in the growth of industrial America. Today, it's the third largest U.S. port on the Great Lakes. But shipping is down these days. And while that's bad for business, it's good for recreation. The last time anyone rode competitively on this river was in the 1800s. Then in 1981, the Toledo Rowing Club was formed and became an immediate success. Membership grew from 12 to more than 150 people. Jim Reisig joined in 1985. He got into rowing literally by accident. The same year the club was started, Reisig crashed his pickup into the back end of a semi.
They told me when I first got out of my accident, I never walked, be able to do nothing. I'd be in a wheelchair the rest of my life, you know, just. And I said, all right, fine. I took it for about a month or two, and I ran into a guy up at U of M. He says, Jim, you were strong before you even got in your accident. Jim, why don't you try rowing?
I think rowing is a logical choice for somebody who doesn't have the use of their legs. This gives him a chance to get out, to feel competition, to keep his heart aerobically in shape, to keep his upper body's very well developed.
Jim was the one who convinced the Toledo Club to include a program for disabled rowers.
They were afraid we were unsafe and that we drowned and stuff, and I says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. For 1 year, you watch us. You send somebody down with all our practices. And they found out that we were safer than they are, actually.
Rowing has enabled him to go on and look forward to the future. He's been to a number of tournaments, and he's won the championship. He also is considering rowing and coaching the Olympic team.
He was an inspiration. The accident changed his life so dramatically, and he just took it to it and made it a good change.
Driftwood left Jim Risey where they had found him, on the Maumee River, and headed on toward Cedar Point. It's located on the tip of a peninsula on the southern shore of Lake Erie. Until a road was built in 1913, all visitors had to come by water. People used to travel by steamship to spend a day at the beach. All that was here then was a bathhouse. Now it's an amusement park that attracts over 3 million visitors a year.
It's right on the waterfront. It's really neat to ride the Ferris wheel and the roller coasters over the water. It's really beautiful.
Cedar Point is one of the 10 most popular amusement parks in the country, and it's always been a huge attraction for Midwesterners. In recent years, attendance has risen, and some people would like to think it's because Lake Erie is being cleaned up. In the family of Great Lakes, Erie is the relative that had a brush with death and then recovered. Everyone is still a little careful around her. The low point came 30 years ago when many were ready to write her off. Then, in the late 60s, most of the states around her passed strong anti-pollution laws, and Lake Erie began to come back to the land of the living. Which brings us and tens of thousands of other people to the Bass Islands off Sandusky, Ohio, and Put-in Bay. It was here on Lake Erie that Oliver Hazard Perry defeated the British in the War of 1812. At the time, he said, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." Now there's a new battle for Put-in Bay, and the message from the front has already been delivered by Pogo, cartoon character and all-around sage. "We have met the enemy," Pogo said, "and they are us."
You're seeing ferries coming across that are just packed, and people are lined up in order to get onto the ferry. The marina is something comparable to a parking lot you may find in New York City. It's just stacks and stacks of boats.
And Bee and Ollie Rathbun are starting to feel like they're under siege.
More people, more buildings, less trees.
We hate to see it happen, but...
So-called improvement.
Bee and Ollie are from Cleveland, but ever since their children were little, they've been coming to Put-in Bay on a regular basis.
We camped here for 20 years or so. Tent camp, and I'm talking about real camping, not RV or anything like that. We pitched a tent.
These days, the Rathbuns have a cottage on the island, which they use whenever they feel the need to get away from the pressures of urban life.
Well, when we first bought the place, we said that we were going to do it 50-50. In other words, 50% work, 50% play.
That was our agreement because I did love to go fishing, and I would like to stay all day, but I agreed with Bee the 50% work and 50% play, and we did. We carried that out pretty well.
For Bee, fixing up the island house became a passion and remains so today. She collected the antiques, made the rugs herself, and decorated the house with dried flowers. She's turned it into a retreat, one of the few places on the island where the Rathbons can escape the crowds.
So this is it.
The lake is another.
Big one.
That heartens Bee and Ollie because it's what attracted them to Put-in Bay in the first place.
The water and the availability of being able just to get out
And the
to the
fishing.
lake. Mhm.
Walleye capital of the world, which makes it attractive to me.
Hold that. Without a license, I hope nobody sees.
There was a time when even Ollie, as much as he loves to fish, would not go out on the water.
Lake Erie was quite, what would I say, filthy or polluted. It was cleaned up considerably. Maybe not 100%. In fact, definitely not 100%, but cleaned up considerably.
And even though he suspects it's what's attracting more tourists to the island, Ollie's happy to see it. He's always had a strong connection to the water. His home in Cleveland reflects that. And until he retired, so did his job. He worked for a mining company that ships iron ore from Lake Superior to the steel mills in Cleveland. As chief electrician for marine operations, Ollie was responsible for keeping the ships running.
I've worked on the vessels on the steamboats all of my life, so I just couldn't leave them. I didn't have any other work that I cared for.
For 33 years, Ollie watched the ore boats travel up the Cuyahoga River and drop their cargo at an area known as the Flats. As far back as the 1850s, this was the center of Cleveland's steel-making industry. For more than a century, it helped make the city a rich and powerful place. But in the mid-1970s, production began to fall off, and so did the economy. People started calling Cleveland the buckle on America's Rust Belt. And although in recent years the industry has started to make a comeback, it's not the way it used to be.
Today, you'd be lucky if you see one or two large freighters coming in to the Port of Cleveland. And that's definitely, it gives you an indication as to how much steel is being produced these days.
And I think that's part of the reason that the waterfront's being turned to tourism.
These days, when Ollie goes down to the Flats, he hardly recognizes the place.
Boy, what changes. Whew.
Instead of steel businesses and ship repair companies, there are restaurants and cafes.
Oh, okay.
And as much as Ollie dislikes what tourism is doing to Put-in Bay's environment, he can't deny what it's done for Cleveland's Flats. Part of its success is its location on the Cuyahoga, a river once so polluted it caught fire. Like the rest of the Flats, it's undergone a change.
There was times when I didn't want to even get my boat near the Cuyahoga River. It was so filthy. I would be so afraid if I ever fell in that river that I would, that the acid would eat my body right up before they could save me. I've seen that improve. Before I retired, I saw that fish were able to live in the river.
It's hard to say what condition the river would be in if the steel business were still at its peak. And that raises a question. Can industry coexist with a healthy environment? It's a question the crew would be asking themselves a lot as they continued their travels along the southern coast of Lake Erie. Of all the Great Lakes, Erie is the shallowest, which makes it more vulnerable to pollution, but also makes it easier to clean up. It only takes 3 years to flush out the lake, as opposed to Superior, which takes more than 100. Keeping it clean is another matter.
These inland lakes, they fall victim to pollution a lot more easily than other places because they are contained and they don't have much outlet. They just sit there and pool all this pollution that comes into them. So it's a very fragile system, much more fragile than I think that we realize.
Even working together, Canada and the United States have had a hard time protecting their boundary waters. In 1972, they signed the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement to monitor and control pollution levels. It had to be revised in 1987, and still the lakes are in danger, especially the one that all the others drain into, Lake Ontario. That's where the driftwood headed next. To get there, they took the Welland Canal, a man-made waterway that connects the two Great Lakes. It was originally constructed to avoid the giant falls that block the river that flows between them. The name of those falls is Niagara, an Indian term that means thunder and water. They have served as a magnet to honeymooners and tourists of all ages and nationalities.
It's an amazing sight. It is. It's absolutely hypnotic. We were just watching it, and your eye just keeps following the water over and over the edge, and you feel almost physically pulled into it.
Every year, more than 10 million tourists stand in wonder of the falls. But as the crew discovered, while humankind could never have created this natural wonder, civilization could easily do it in.
We were riding on the Maid of the Mist. It's a boat that goes up and kind of circles around right at the outflow of the falls, right where the water's crashing all around you. And as we were coming back down, kind of laughing from the adventure, we noticed along the side of the river there was just inches and inches of a dirty brown scum on the water.
The Maid of the Mist, the boat that Tom, Julie, Bill, and millions of tourists ride to see the falls, takes its name from Indian legend. According to the story, a plague hit the tribe and could not be lifted until the daughter of the chief was thrown into the river to live forever among the gods under the falls. But now a new plague has come to Niagara: pollution from industrial waste, municipal sewage, and the most significant source along the river, hazardous dump sites. They've identified 20 such places on the U.S. side, none on the Canadian.
Somewhere along the lines, the American side made the choice to build factories that ended up polluting the water, and the Canadian side ended up creating a lot of parks. The Americans prospered a lot more economically. However, they're now paying the price, and you wonder in retrospect who was smarter.
You know, I mean, the pollution is not, does not keep to their side. I mean, there isn't an imaginary line down the middle.
Margarita Howe lives on the Canadian side of the river in the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake. She is well known in the area as an environmental activist.
So we went on up there and met with her, and she was a firecracker. She was absolutely amazing, very articulate, very gutsy woman, and as she said, a very angry woman.
I sometimes think maybe it's because I'm half Italian, and it's that half Italian part of me, you know, sort of a fighter.
What galls Margarita most is what's happened to the Niagara River.
Name it, and you've got it. You've got dioxins, Myrex, PCBs. I mean, it's just the myriad of chemicals from the chemical companies in Niagara Falls, New York. Don't go too far. Your feet might come off.
Okay, Jojo. What's it like?
She moved here 35 years ago, and it's just been within the last decade or so that she has decided to go and address the problem of the falls and the pollution and the companies and to dedicate pretty much the rest of her life to a cause.
What got her started was a petition to stop a chemical disposal company from dumping waste into the Niagara River.
I didn't know anything about anything. I didn't know what the environment was about. However, I did learn, and I learned that this was not a good idea. We were 2 miles downstream from where the pipeline would go into the river, and I thought, what a stupid thing to do.
With their drinking water in jeopardy, the community backed Margarita 100%. She was named chairperson of Canada's Operation Clean and became an active spokesperson. For about 1.5 years, she attended various hearings and called on every official she could think of. Finally, the government decided to give Niagara-on-the-Lake another source of drinking water. In gratitude, the town named Margarita Citizen of the Year. 4 years later, she was awarded the Order of Canada.
And at that time, I noticed a definite change in the attitude of the people in town. Their needs had been met. Quite frankly, they didn't give a damn about anything else. I mean, they had gotten another source of drinking water, and that was it. And they really didn't look at the broader picture at all.
Niagara-on-the-Lake is a community that runs on tourist dollars. Some citizens were afraid that any more adverse publicity would ruin the town's economy.
And do you want strawberries?
But Margarita herself runs a bed and breakfast, which depends on tourism, and she felt it was more important to continue her fight.
I felt bad as an American, realizing just how much responsibility my country carries for this pollution, but she really feels that it's a common problem to all people, and it's not something that really is limited to particular international boundary lines.
We could do without a lot of things, but we need water, both for our bodies and for our souls.
Sister Margene Hoffman lives almost directly across the river from Margarita at the Convent of Stella Niagara in Lewiston, New York. It's a religious order based on the teachings of St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis was known for his love of life and nature. So it's ironic that the convent sits above one of the most polluted bodies of water in the continent. And that concerns Sister Margene just as much as it does Margarita.
We come into this world in a pool of water, our mother's womb. We are baptized, washed, as we say, with God's water. And so industry, by polluting those waters, is really contaminating that very source of our life. And even that inner spirit.
Like Margarita, Sister Margene became actively involved in environmental issues after moving to this area. She had come here from Minnesota, where she had experience working with flood victims. But that did not prepare her for the man-made disaster that became known as Love Canal.
She brought us to this middle-class suburban neighborhood that looked like any other neighborhood in anywhere USA. The only problem is that this place was abandoned.
And we're living here.
Yeah. Well, the people who lived here were just hardworking, common, ordinary people who had, I guess, and wanted to have sort of a piece of or a slice of that, what's called, for good or ill, the American dream. All of a sudden, that very existence was really threatened, and the coping, they didn't quite know what to do with that. And this is, see the fenced-in area right here? Well, that's Love Canal. See how high it is?
Right.
When I first came here 11 years ago, that was flat. It was an open field. It looks like a football field. Children used it for a playground. And many times they would talk about, they would run through here and they called them hot rocks or popping rocks. And these things would explode, and those are different kind of chemicals. Kids burned their legs on them. You could see stuff oozing up out of the ground.
50 years ago, this was the dumping place for Niagara Falls, New York. Everything from garbage to hazardous materials. One chemical company buried nearly 22,000 tons of toxic waste in the abandoned canal. Later, houses were built on the property. But it was only after the community had been established that people began to notice those toxins percolating to the surface.
And as they told things like, my child has this learning difficulty, or I've had this cancer, or there's been this suicide in our family, or down the road, or did you know, they started to compare, and other persons were sitting there and say, you too?
By 1979, when Sister Margene arrived, things had gotten so bad, people were being told to move out of their homes.
It was difficult to know exactly what role one should play. And then you keep coming back to, why did I come here? And it was to address the human suffering at Love Canal.
She set up an office in a neighborhood church. Often she was the liaison between residents and government officials, talking to everyone from the mayor of Niagara Falls to President Carter. But her hardest job was convincing people they no longer had a place to live.
And you could understand why. A lot of people who have been living there all their life, they're not just going to pick up their whole lives and move. The thing that amazed me the most is that people are moving back to Love Canal.
They say the place is safe now, but it makes you wonder because you still see the chemical plants operating. And you got to wonder what they're doing with all their waste.
It's a constant watchdogging operation. I mean, we still have too many thousands of pounds of toxic chemicals that go into the Niagara River every day. And it flows right down here on the lower Niagara into the mouth of Lake Ontario. And there are times, yes, when you border on bitterness, that nothing's being done. And I can look across the river to Margarita and say, there's that river between us, and that we are bonded together by, as I said, that source, that life-giving source, that water. And then to remember that where there is no vision, the people perish. Amen.
The crew rejoined Driftwood on the Welland Canal and headed out onto Lake Ontario toward Canada's largest and most populous city, Toronto. There's a story they like to tell here about a TV production company that came to Toronto to shoot a cop show. They needed a seedy-looking area, and in the entire city they couldn't find one that fit the bill. So they picked a location, built a set on it to make it look dirty. A little while later, they took a break. When they came back, the set was gone. City workers had cleaned it up. Some say Toronto's the ideal city, the future capital of North America.
You walk along a street like Yonge Street and it's just alive with people from all over the place. You talk about the United States being a melting pot. I think Toronto's a melting pot for Canada.
I was born and raised there, and I have been on the Driftwood project for close to 3 years. And every time I seem to go back, which is a period of maybe half a year, there's a new skyscraper built. There's condominiums being placed. There's development all along the waterfront.
Right across from the skyline of Toronto, there's a small island called Ward's Island, and it's sort of an oasis from the city.
The only way to get there is by ferry. For years, it carried thousands of day trippers to the island, among them Bill Arnold.
As a young boy, our family, we'd go over to the island, have picnics, and just have a fun time. People are allowed to go and travel through the community, walk through and see the homes and the beautiful gardens. And it just so happened we came upon a home that was just right overlooking the skyline of Toronto, and this is where we came upon Elizabeth Amer.
Sure, you're gonna wash, eh? How about them Blue Jays?
Her house out on the island is one that her family's had since 1911, and she lives there now with her daughter, and it's a beautiful place.
Unlike most homeowners, Elizabeth does not own the property her house is built on. No one here does. They lease the land from the city, which owns the entire island. For years, especially during the housing shortage after World War II, people were encouraged to build homes here, but they were never given rights to the land. So in the 1950s, when the city decided to turn the place into a park, residents had no say in the matter.
They tore down over 600 homes and just anything that was there. It was a complete rout of the entire place. And all that's left now is really a remnant.
Elizabeth wasn't against the idea of a park. She just didn't want her neighborhood destroyed. And she couldn't see why the island couldn't have both.
I was not prepared to stand by and let the municipality take my home and the home of my neighbors, and therefore I was prepared to fight.
Elizabeth organized the residents. They fought City Hall and won, temporarily. They can keep their homes on the island, but only until the year 2005. So the fight is far from over. It helps to have friends in high places, and these days Ward Islanders do. Elizabeth Amer.
She's the councilperson for Ward 5, which includes the island and a large part of the waterfront of Toronto.
I had been very active politically here, and that had brought me into contact, obviously, with the what was then the enemy and which is now myself. There's a kind of pogo quality to that. So it seemed logical to some people that I should make that move into municipal politics.
One of the things that she's been focusing on is the whole waterfront of Toronto, because there's a lot of condominiums, a lot of big buildings right along the waterfront.
Elizabeth would prefer fewer buildings and more places where people can have access to the lake, a park, if you will. That may seem like she switched sides, but she really hasn't. Because from the very beginning, all she wanted was to prevent one thing from completely replacing another.
I don't take the position that development is bad, but I think that when it dominates to the exclusion of all other influences, that isn't correct. It's the quality of the experience that we have to think about. We also have to think ahead 100 years. I mean, what's this going to be like in 100 years? It's a critical question.
It's a question that must be asked about the Great Lakes as well, because these waters that form a bond between two nations are as fragile as they are beautiful. Toronto was Driftwood's last stop on the eastern Great Lakes. The crew had come almost full circle, stopping at towns in Canada and America. They had noted some differences as they traveled between the two countries, but in the end, they were more impressed with the similarities.
You go to Thessalon and you go to McGregor Bay, you can't forget the water. It's right there all the time, and they're constantly working in it and around it.
You get into larger areas of Toronto and Cleveland, Detroit, and you're dealing with people who don't even think about it. They look out at this stretch of lake and think that it's endless and that we can take from it and deposit whatever we wish for, how many thousands of years.
We've seen a lot of the damage and degradation that's occurred here, and we've also seen a lot of the good that comes out of people using this resource wisely and appreciating it. I think people hopefully are really coming to realize that this is something that we have to take care of for the common good.
In the weeks ahead, join the crew of the Driftwood as they travel more than 25,000 miles and rediscover the stories along the waterways that link the people of North America with one another and the rest of the world. Come along as they explore man's relationship with the water he treasures and despoils, plays with and fights with, and cannot live without. Join these young people on the next leg of On the Waterways.
Funding for this program was provided by the Bamana Corporation of Fort Wayne, Indiana.